Okay. Welcome back, everyone. It's good to see all of your screens. And it's good to be here with you tonight. I know that life is very hectic, so I appreciate the time that you're spending with us. And I think we'll have a really good conversation tonight. I wanted to introduce the Reverend Dr. Jin S. Kim. He is the founding pastor of Church of All Nations and founder of Underground Seminary. In 1975, his family emigrated from Korea when he was 7 years old, like he was explaining. He grew up in South Carolina and Georgia, went to Georgia Tech, Princeton Seminary, and has a doctorate of ministry from Columbia University. Jin has loved,
Seminary.
Excuse me?
Columbia Seminary.
Yeah, Columbia Seminary, yes. Jin has loved serving the local church, especially the beautiful people of Cannes. Do you call yourselves Cannes or?
Yeah, Church of All Nations is Cannes.
Yes. Okay. As a pastor continuously since 1993 and takes his apostolic calling seriously in sharing the good news of Jesus far and wide. He is passionate about justice, ecumenical unity, and decolonizing the church in favor of village renewal. He and Sue Pak love being with their two grown children and their parents. I'm assuming their parents meaning your parents.
My parents.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay. All right, so
my parents live with us.
Okay, it's really great to have you here with us tonight. We have, Jen and I have crossed paths in the past, but this is the first time that we've reconnected after many years. So it's just good to have him here in this space today. So today's guiding question is, should churches move towards becoming multiracial? And I thought that Jin could speak especially well to this question. I didn't know if you wanted to say a few introductory words before we got into the questions themselves, or if you just wanted to get started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can just jump right into that question.
Okay.
I mean, my most direct answer would be no.
Okay.
Because it feels like a universal question.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of churches should try.
Mm-hmm.
It really, in my opinion, depends on the socio-historical context. I think about Native American and African American communities here in this country that were deprived in a systematic manner their language, customs, culture, religious beliefs, way of life. And so to kind of pressure these historically exploited communities to be multicultural is to, I don't know, it sounds just too much like assimilation, and
Sure.
that does not work well for historically oppressed communities.
Sure.
So I think every community should have the time and space they need to develop a strong identity and some cultural preservation. And when there is a sufficient solidity in those things, then they might venture into kind of a cross-cultural experience. And I think, our socio-historical background really matters a lot. For those of us who came from East Asia in recent decades, that's largely due to the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, championed by then junior senator from Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy. And that allowed non-Western nations to send large numbers of immigrants for the first time to this country. And Korea was one of those countries that took advantage of that, sending eventually 30,000 immigrants per year by the mid-70s. So my family came in the first wave of that, the first 10 years. And unlike the immigration patterns from Europe, where it was the average people, a lot of riffraff actually from Europe that came here, the immigration policy of the United States toward non-Western nations was that only the elites would come here. So those of us, and not all of us, certainly, but sociologically,
maybe refugees, yeah.
Right. Sociologically speaking, those of us from China, Japan, and Korea were kind of, filtered so that those with education and good jobs and training were the ones who were allowed to come here. So if you have a certain kind of cultural and historical confidence and bring that kind of confidence to a new country, then some kind of move toward multicultural engagement may make sense. But I think that there has to be a very, very keen eye and vigilance about not letting multiculturalism and assimilation be conflated.
Mhm.
Because assimilation just means the dominant culture absorbs the less powerful and privileged cultures around them into the dominant culture. So a lot of what passes for multicultural around this country is actually just sly assimilationism, and I don't think that has integrity. So
Mhm.
it's strong people from various backgrounds who are not reactive, but nevertheless have a real strong sense of their historical and cultural identity to be able to form a healthy, robust, and mutually respectful multicultural church and community.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we kind of jumped to the end um, with your response to the guiding question, which is fine, great. But I'm wondering maybe if we can also just kind of unpack it from starting with your own experience with the Church of All Nations. And as I understand it, it started out as a Korean American church. So what stirred you and others to intentionally transform it into a multiracial church in the context of Minneapolis?
Hmm.
And
Yes,
were
great
there kind of
question.
feelings of loss that you and others needed to navigate, even with the excitement of following God's call?
Oh, yes, there was loss all along the way, and it's painful, but I'm happy to share that as fellow Christians here so we can learn from each other. But in 1999, I heeded the advice of my mentor. I have a lifelong mentor, first generation Korean immigrant pastor, and he was working in Louisville at the time at our headquarters. And he wanted me to join him there because he saw that I'm a kind of a big picture thinker, and he thought that suited me for judicatory denominational service. So there was a good historic Korean immigrant church here in Minneapolis um, that he thought I should apply for and stay here just a few years until there was a suitable position that opened up in at the Presbyterian Center in Louisville. But I was an associate pastor for English ministry, and it was very dynamic, and we loved each other very deeply, and it was a really young, dynamic group of Korean Americans. But Twin Cities is also like ground zero for Korean adoption. There are more Korean adoptees here in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, than there are Korean immigrants, believe it or not. This is the only metropolitan area in the country where adoptees would outnumber immigrants like myself. So we had some white parents of Korean adopted children. We had, one random African person from Liberia, one random African American person, one random white college student from University of Minnesota, just things like that. And but they liked our church and they wouldn't leave. So I'm wondering, goodness, what is God doing here? I know how to do English ministry. That's what I grew up in. That's what I was trained for. But like, what am I supposed to do with those people, right? That's what I
Mhm,
call
mhm,
it. And then I began to ask the question, what would it be like where everybody felt not like first and second class citizens, but truly included as the children of God, and given the integrity of their cultural background and respect for their historical journey, and then really relate to each other as sisters and brothers, but not in an individualistic way, but with all of our history behind us as part of our identity and respecting each other that way. So it took some effort, but we got a blessing both from the first generation immigrant church
mm,
and our local presbytery, the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area, to launch as a new multicultural church. So honestly, when we launched, we were really more like a church of one nation.
mhm,
Uh, our name was more aspirational
mhm.
than reflective of reality, but I'm happy to report that after all these years, we have people from about 30 different nationalities and cultures including Native Americans and African Americans, of course, but people from all over the world.
Mhm.
Interestingly, about 10 years ago, we became a majority white church.
Mm,
Right now, our white members are about 58%.
mm,
And so I feel like I have pretty good predictive powers, but that we would eventually become a majority white church is something I never envisioned. And
mhm,
honestly, I was kind of sad about that development when it happened, because we're in a, not because I have anything against white people, of course, but because we're already in a white dominant society. And also I just could not predict that, white people would want to join a small multicultural, you know, Asian based church. So I had a, steep learning curve and learned a lot along the way. But I think that we have, over our last 18 years as a congregation, have continued to grow in depth and strength because we will not compromise um, our integrity, our messaging, our prophetic witness, our insistence on the full dignity and humanity of each person, and not just as individuals like we talked about before, but in their entire socio-historical background and journey. And that has cost us, all kinds of members over the years, including, and this was especially painful, a good number of Korean American second generation people like me and my wife who were becoming too radical in our,
I'm sorry.
and around 2015 we lost a number of our Korean American and other Asian American members who had, high levels of education, good jobs, strong income, because we signed on with the Black Lives Matter movement right away when it launched. I mean, we had already been a explicitly anti-racist congregation from the beginning, but the Black Lives Matter movement really kicked off with what happened with Trayvon Martin in Florida, and then the Ferguson uh, situation. And just some people thought that there was too much, and also they could see that um, I was really trying to get our young people, our youth and children, prepared for a post-colonial future rather than just fitting in to white supremacist capitalism. So, and they wanted their children to go to all the name brand schools in the East Coast and West Coast, the Ivy League schools, and then move into, white privilege and power. And I was preaching very adamantly that that is actually the path um, to mental illness and to the loss of our cultural heritage. So multicultural for me means everybody really value the cultural background that they come from, not just assimilate to the dominant culture. But I would say now we're a stronger congregation than we've ever been, and we've actually grown in membership and finances and all the metrics over the last 2 years of the pandemic, which is, surprised me and all of our elders too. But yeah, we have really been pleasantly surprised.
Mhm.
We have grown and gotten stronger through the pandemic than we've ever been. So we're really grateful.
That's great to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Can you talk maybe a little more like, can you give some examples of how that's kind of reflected in your building of community or in your worship services, or because you really want each member of your congregation to bring all of their sociocultural identity with them to the table, right? And so I
Mhm.
can definitely hear how you are preaching prophetically. You're really trying to promote racial justice in your sermons and in the content that you give. But I'm wondering if there are other ways that you kind of also incorporate a kind of multiracial lens.
Yeah, I think maybe just talking about how we do our worship service might be illustrative.
Mhm,
It's a kind of a standard Presbyterian mainline liturgical service. The gathering, um, the the word, the Eucharist, the sending, and so we have kind of a standard liturgy. But there's a tremendous amount of flexibility and spontaneity within it, and we have many people in our congregation lead all various parts of the service. And there are, you know, a lot of services where I have no visible leadership at all. Um, we have a very large staff. I mean, we have, including children, maybe about 175 people, uh,
Mhm.
but our staff is like 17 people,
Oh,
uh,
wow. Okay.
including about 7 or 8 ordained pastors.
Mhm.
Only 6 of us are on paid staff, and I'm the only full-time, like called, you know, board of pensions and all that.
Mhm.
I'm the only full-time pastor in pay, but actually 5 of us are full-time, but the other 4 get free housing and free use of church cars
Mhm.
and other benefits. So we make life work like that. But anyway, if our worship service has a lot of different representation throughout with a variety of with diverse people, and
Mhm.
then we have all kinds of different people preaching on a regular basis, and then we have. I've always taught my people that good preaching is testimony, and a good testimony preaches.
Mhm.
So um, we have to bring our true self and our genuine faith to the sermonic moment if it is really going to touch the people. And also when people testify and when they really hit the bedrock of their own humanity, they will be able to touch the bedrock of others' humanity, even across cultural lines. So we regularly offer our pulpit, sometimes during the offering time, if it's like a 5 to 10 minute 5 to 15 minute offering. But if somebody wants to give like a much deeper testimony, we call it via testimonium, Latin for testimony on the way. Not I was lost, but now I'm found. I was a sinner, but now I'm a saint. But like these are the struggles I'm going through right now. And sometimes I don't even know if God is there, but this is where I am. And I'm grateful that I have a community to help walk me through this. So we regularly invite people to give their testimony wherever they are, even if they're struggling with their faith, um, to share that if they want. And then, of course, people, as they share their testimony, they bring their cultural background into it. So it's also an opportunity for us to learn about each other's cultural background and not just, you know, personal background.
Mhm.
In that way, we hear each other's stories and then rally around each other and advocate for each other
Mhm.
by sharing deeply our experiences with one another. Of course, that requires that we be a safe space,
Mhm.
and we try to do that. And we are not safe because when somebody makes a, you know, an inappropriate remark, we don't participate in the call out culture. Um, but we do correct, but not in a shaming, publicly shaming way.
Mhm.
So, we, you know, we want to make it a safe place,
Mhm.
but try to do that through a kind of firmness, clarity, and mutuality.
Mhm. That's helpful to hear. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, what do you need to do in order to create that safe space? Because I know that sometimes I've been called to sort of um, share from my own Korean American perspective and experience, but sometimes I've felt like, I mean, just to be honest, like a token, or that I'm supposed to sort of bring diversity into a space. And I'm wondering how you sort of create a safe space so that people can bring all of their cultural experiences and upbringing formation without veering into that.
Well, there's no way to actually know until
Mhm.
you do it, right? So
Mhm.
takes the risk, and this happened very, very early on when we launched the church. Someone takes the risk of sharing really honestly and vulnerably. Now, does the congregation embrace that whole person,
Mhm.
their experience, their whole background, generations in their home culture that shaped them? Do we embrace them for all that they are as a socio-historical person and not just the individual with a personality that we see? If the congregation embraces that person's whole self, then that person is going to feel like they were received, they were seen, they were heard, and they'll feel safe. And then other people start to catch on that, yes, if you share, all of you will be embraced. And so, I mean, these days, there's no question about safety in that way because so many people in the congregation have testified And so many people then continue to testify how they have been wholly embraced by the whole congregation.
Thank you. Do you think that, I mean, you're a PCUSA church, and I'm
Mhm.
just curious, and you're actually featured in the book that the small groups are going through. It's called Race in America, Christians Respond to the Crisis. Um,
Wait,
and
who wrote that book?
it's written by a number of different authors, but it's edited by Laura Heifetz and I can't remember the other person, but it's like written
Oh,
by
I had no idea we were in there.
yeah, it's a small book, but I think it's very helpful to help us kind of navigate some of the language around race. And also what we liked also about it was that it kind of integrated the theological aspect of it into the conversation as well. But I guess I'm wondering, do you think that Presbyterian churches face unique challenges in becoming multiracial, our denomination? And what are, I mean, I guess you have kind of talked about some practical first steps. Um, but yeah, I'm just kind of curious if you think that that is something that maybe majority white congregations should be doing, or I do think that there is
Mhm.
still a space for ethnic or immigrant church communities to kind of create a kind of sanctuary space for their communities. But I'm just curious what your thoughts might be on that.
I think that being Presbyterian, and by the way, I'm a third generation Presbyterian um, from my grandmother in Korea, who became a Presbyterian Christian in the early 1900s, early part of American Presbyterian missions to Korea. So I'm proud to be Presbyterian, and it's my ecclesiastical family. But being Presbyterian is both a blessing and a liability. The blessing is, our strong emphasis on the sovereignty of God. If God is sovereign over the whole world, then whatever divides us is really quite minor compared to what unites us under the banner of our Creator God. So there are a number of reformed theological commitments that I think are helpful for unity and for reconciliation and for mutual understanding. But doctrine is no match for history because it's history that actually shapes who we are. And this is the great liability of being Presbyterian, is that historically Presbyterians in the United States come from Scottish stock. And the Scots early on were largely the overseers, um, you know, uh, supervising slaves, meaning beating them, raping them, controlling them, torturing them on behalf of their English masters. So it's the early English, and they were Church of England, right? Episcopalians who owned the plantations and were the slave owners, most of the founding fathers, for instance. And then they hired the Scots, who that they had oppressed and colonized centuries before in the British Isle, and then now use them as their to do their dirty work, basically. So this is why Anglicans or Episcopalians have been wealthier Christians in this country. They were the wealthiest Christians forever. Something like 20 to 30 years ago, Presbyterians finally overtook Episcopalians as the wealthiest per capita Christians in North America. And that's because of our commitment to education. So education finally overtook old money. But we Presbyterians through slavery have a nasty history in this country. And I think I've been to Scotland a number of times, and Scottish people are wonderful, wonderful people. But Scottish Presbyterianism is deeply problematic because the founder is basically John Knox, and that guy was a sociopath, incredibly violent, and also sexist, and highly colonialistic and imperialistic. And I mean, John Calvin had his own problems, but he was not as rough as John Knox. So American Presbyterianism owes its spirit largely to John Knox, far more than to John Calvin. So that kind of belligerence and schismatic tendency and racism, frankly, racism and sexism is deeply rooted in our American Presbyterian heritage. And if we don't square with that honestly, then um, I truly believe that the truth will set us free. So I know every ecclesiastical tradition has its own problems. So, but I'm not part of those traditions. Those people need to confess their sins. But I'm a Presbyterian, and I have no problem confessing my sins as a Presbyterian leader. That's my heritage now, and those are sins that I'm going to confess collectively. But if we do, then I believe that we get on the road to honesty and to true freedom. We have a lot stacked against us. It is incredibly difficult because of the actual history of Presbyterianism in this country for us to move to genuine racial reconciliation and a multicultural embodiment of the people of God, because our history works so deeply against us. But the more we're aware of it, the more we have a shot at overcoming it.
Thank you, Jin. So yeah, I think that's a powerful note to end on. The reality that Presbyterians, our denomination, we still have a racial reckoning that we have to do within our denomination. And it's not an issue that's just, the issue of racism is not an issue that's just out there, but it's actually embedded into the fabric and the history of our denomination.
Oh, Sujin, can I just
Yeah,
add one thing before I
sure.
exit?
Yeah.
Just, like a prophetic voice is calling out the powers and principalities for what they are,
Mhm.
naming the oppressor as legion, meaning Roman imperial power. In our context, American military industrial complex and its racist capitalist infrastructure. But our church is so much more than that. Um, our, I mean, that we have, 30 different nationalities and cultures represented is something we're very proud of course. But just as remarkable, if not more, is that the average age of our adults, meaning confirmation age and above. So the average age of our adult membership, 14 and above, is about 32. So we have a ton of young people in this church, and they drive this church. I'm considered part of the older crowd in our congregation. One of the reasons why we consistently attract young people is not just because we have a diverse worship service, but in 2013, we launched our first church-based community house. In 2014, we launched our post-colonial and radical underground seminary. In 2015, we launched K Mama Sauce, which now sells in every Target in the Twin Cities and is available on Amazon and, better yet, our kmama.com store. And since then, we've launched about one community house and one church-based business per year. So more and more, we give better jobs, more humane jobs to our members, more humane living than either marrying, too quick that you're not ready for, or a life of loneliness, which this society can be. Right now, 50 of our members live in our 8 intentional Christian community houses, church-based houses.
Mhm.
And it is one of the most dynamic things happening in our church. And we're one of the very few, if not only, church-based intentional Christian community in the country. And then, of course, we're very anti-capitalist, but we're very pro-entrepreneurial. So one of the things that we have is, how do we exploit capitalism for village renewal?
Mhm.
In other words, how do we be as innocent as a dove in our heart and as shrewd as a snake, so that we give to Caesar only the minimum we can give to Caesar, and the rest we do for village renewal? So calling out, racism and all of that, and heteropatriarchy and homophobia, calling all those things out is important. But for a church to really have dynamism and for a church to have a long shelf life, all kinds of innovation must be a part of its DNA and its very core.
Right.
And that means that one must move beyond the framework of success and failure.
Mhm.
In my opinion, there is no success or failure. There is just learning or not learning. if we're always learning from our experience, then that's success.
Yeah.
So we don't have sayings like we've always done it that way. We have a very high tolerance for risk and failure. One of our sayings is we are a high risk, low anxiety church.
Mhm.
And most churches are low risk, high anxiety churches.
Mhm.
One of the reasons why we have low anxiety is right from the beginning when we launched 18 years ago, we were ready to go out of business. We said if we ever spend more energy on institutional preservation than on embodying the gospel and taking risks for every member of our church, then the salt has lost its saltiness and it is good for nothing than be thrown out and be trampled on. So we are ready to pull the plug on our church, on our seminary, on our community houses, on our businesses, on anything, our permaculture work that we do, if we start to be more concerned with institutional preservation than on bearing a new life. So just wanted to add that,
Oh, no, that's great.
yeah, the core of our congregation is actually what we do,
Yeah,
not what we're against.
right. No, that's really great. I mean, and that's, yeah, I wanted to hear more about the various innovative things that you're working on and transform, and how you have transformed understanding of community, challenged kind of what people think community should look like, not only in society, but also within the church. I'm wondering, would you be okay with taking a couple of questions before you leave?
Sure, happy
Okay,
to.
so that would be great. So if maybe just two questions, if people are interested before we go into breakout rooms. Karen, go ahead. I'm gonna, do you want to unmute? Go ahead and unmute. Okay, there you go.
Some of you might know Rob Stewart. He was associate pastor at St. Mark many years ago and is Spirit of the Desert. We are looking at Cathedral City and the environment of Coachella with 6 Presbyterian churches. One is Korean. So Pastor Jin's remark was amazing to me, is that I always wondered why our Korean churches stayed Korean and didn't integrate with us, or we with them. And now he's shown me a different way, for which I'm grateful. But I think that Rob Stewart would be very interested in talking with you, since we've got a committee now about our commonalities of these very small churches scattered in the Coachella Valley. So I hope that Sue Jean will help me get in touch with you. I think we really need to talk with you about this.
So can you actually, I'm wondering if you had a question with your comment, or is it just more like you want to be able to?
Well, I think we need to look at his overview.
Mhm.
How you can unite
Yeah.
6 congregations and have something in common. The Korean church will stay as Korean, and the rest, we have a lot of Hispanics here in the Coachella Valley. And his overview, I took notes, kind of threw me about how we find commonalities with these churches, or if it's even possible.
Okay. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jin, did you want to respond to that, or?
I'm open to conversation. So I'll just take that as a constructive comment.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? We have Bettina, go ahead.
Thanks, Eugene, and thanks, Pastor Jin, for your comments and your thoughts and sharing with us. I'm wondering, you talked a lot about affirming the racial identities and the identities just in general, right? Like accepting people as wholly who they are. How does the church work to affirm, so New Hope is a multiracial congregation, but very much a Black church by identity, right? And so how do we work to continue to honor and affirm the identities, right? Like really do that work, right? Where it doesn't become an assimilation or an appropriation, right, of a particular identity, but that we really work to truly honor each person's unique identity within the body of Christ to make this beloved community, right? So could you give us a little bit more insight about how we do that work to be culturally sustaining and affirming within a context of either being multiracial or like as we work to affirm our own identities in our own cultures?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, well, just maybe I can share some examples of what we've done. When we first moved into this building, we were founded out of the Korean church context, but 2 years after, we kept growing, and they said, "You're kind of crowding us, you young multicultural people. Go and find a new home, please." So there was a kind of a dying white Presbyterian church about 5 miles away, and we were just renting at first, but they were down to about like 12, 15 people in worship, and so they just said, "You know what? Let's merge, and we'll turn over the building to you." And at first, they wanted to share power. And I said, we're not going to share power, because you cannot put old wine in new wineskin or it will burst. But if you trust us and you hand everything over to us and don't insist on being on session, then we can make it work. And it took them, and then we called off talks because they wouldn't. But they got desperate enough a few months later to say, okay, so they declared unconditional surrender, and then we merged. And then it's been wonderful for the last 16 of the 18 years we've been at church. One of the things we did after the merger was we removed all the white Jesuses from the building. I cannot believe how many blonde hair, blue-eyed Scandinavian Jesuses littered the church. So removed them, got rid of all of them, got rid of all the Christian and American flags, whether they were in the sanctuary or the fellowship hall. And then there was some complaining. Hey, my grandfather served in World War II and things like that. Okay, it's like I'm an Asian person. We respect our elders, so I understand that is a painful thing. But you know what? Instead of a Christian and American flag on the chancel, let's put them all up around the rafters. So we have a very tall roofline steeple within the building, and we have 54 flags that represent all the people in our church and many other countries that we have a relationship with or that we pray for, including European countries. Because we're in Minnesota, so we have a lot of people of Swedish, Norwegian, German, Danish descent, plus, of course, Irish and English and French and all that. So we have all those flags up there. So yeah, you want to see the American flag? There it is, among all of the 54 up there. And then for a long time, we had our liturgist, whoever the liturgist was for the month, do a profile of the nation of the week. So we would highlight Sweden, and then the next week we would highlight Kenya, and the next week Jamaica. So of course, if you're from that country, then you're proud that your country is being featured, and then we learn something about that country, during the service. But we've done so many rounds now that we kind of stopped doing that after many years, and the congregation's fine with that. Another thing is that I've traveled quite a bit. I've been to over 50 countries around the world, mostly for speaking engagements. But it has given me a chance to visit our members' families. And it's always a family reunion when I visit my members' home countries of origin. And then I learn something about their background. And another thing is taking history seriously. It's just, like I said a number of times tonight, it's not enough to know somebody as just a person and personality. We have to know, if you want African Americans in your church, you have to know the history of the African American experience in this country. Otherwise, if you don't know the history, then it's tokenizing. If you want Native Americans, if you want Liberians or anyone, or if you're like an all Korean church and you want a few white people, then you got to study white history. You got to understand like where these people came from, and even like what white people is, because they used to have a culture. They used to be like Dutch or something. And then they come here and they're white people. That is a socio-historical construction that happened in 1640. right? There is a historical moment when that happened. It was a deal with the devil, but that's what happened. And you know, we call whiteness in our church an anti-culture. So Dutch, French, Russians, English, Italians, they all have cultures. But whiteness in America is not a culture, it is a trauma effect. It is an anti-culture. And how do we understand that? How do we study that? How do we teach that? You know, one thing that unites all of us at Church Foundations is that we are all against whiteness. Not only are we against white supremacy, that's easy for a progressive church. Every single person at Church Foundations, including our 58% white members, are against whiteness as a demonic manifestation. So whiteness is this weird trauma effect culture that was formed over the last 400 years as a bargain with the devil to stop fighting as they did during the 30 Years' War in Europe, and then have a détente amongst themselves at the expense of Black and brown bodies, right? So it's a wonderful way for us to unite around something that we name as demonic, and at the same time have deep compassion. One thing we say is white people are the children of God, just like everybody else. So our humanity is to be respected, is intact, no matter what color we are. But whiteness is a demonic possession, and all of us are on some spectrum of having that disease. It's like cancer. So I also have the disease of whiteness in me. African Americans have it. You know, all of us have some level of, you know, stage 1 through 4 cancer of whiteness. So identifying that is critically important if we are really going to understand each other, respect each other, and even have compassion for each other. So that is, it's not just about like welcoming people. It's about the degree of courage we have to face the truth and to name names and to speak history bluntly and clearly, but not reactively, because reactivity makes us push each other away. But with courage and boldness and winsomeness, name things for what they are. Name it legion, name it whiteness, and then experience the power and the grace of God through that collective truth telling.
Wow, thank you. Preach. So any other questions or thoughts before we go into breakout rooms? I want to. Okay,
I share, and
yes.
I will share a 40-second thought. I
Okay.
will so try. I want to thank you for everything that you have shared, because in so many ways you are sharing the journey and the story of New Hope. One of the things that we have found that is so centering to respecting culture within a church that was founded in its Blackness is having the community voice, very similar to what you were doing. And it's an expression where people tell a testimony, they share their story. And the congregation is made up of people. They might be a Hawaiian person or a Dutch Indonesian person who is speaking of their struggle and their faith. And what we find that when we have these community voices is that the playing field becomes a bit level in relational inspiration and friendship, which is necessary. But I can say that I think I was in stage 2 cancer of whiteness before I came to California. Stage 2, you could call me Sister Assimilation, because my home presbytery was bent on me being a good Presbyterian. I was brought down to, and literally brought to Atlanta to experience Columbia Theological Seminary, and was told, if you are a good Presbyterian, our presbytery will cover your full education, set you up in a beautiful church. And then I went over to ITC and got set free. And I took classes at Columbia, take nothing from Columbia, took many classes, Greek school, a lot of classes. But I got set free and affirmed at ITC for the authenticity of who God is. And I seek to bring that to New Hope, while seeking to do many of the things that you've said tonight. But if I keep on talking, we won't have time in our breakout rooms.
That's okay.
But I just want to thank you for the affirmation that speaks to so much of where the church is today and where we're seeking to go. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so
Yes,
much.
and I know all of you are not able to speak here, but may I just say, as a Korean person that has practiced being in touch with Ki or Chi, the energy and life force of the universe, that I also believe is the Holy Spirit. I feel all of your spirit so palpably. And I think those of you who are pastoral leaders, you're so blessed with this congregation. And you're also courageous to invite someone like me that you don't know to a really honest and frank and hard, but hopefully hopeful conversation like this. So I feel your love and your spirit, and may God bless you all abundantly. And as Pastor Janetta just said about testimony, we could not practice testimony if the African American church has not nurtured that practice for centuries. They were denied education. They were denied learning and reading for the most part. And one thing they could not take away from African Americans was their spirit, and the testimony is a coming through of spirit among the Black people. So we borrow so heavily from the African American experience. We have such a debt of gratitude for all of you who have stood the ground and carried on that spirit. So thank you all for giving me this privilege of sharing a little bit of our story with you. You're all such faithful people, and may you do this work with the wind of the Holy Spirit behind you.
Thank you so much, Jin. God bless and amen to all that you
Amen.
shared.
Good connecting with you again, Sujin.
Yeah, we'll touch
Okay.
base later. Take care.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Blessings.